I just wanted to have, a sort of panel where folks that have these kind of so-called fringe ideas, are just put in the company of each other. So many times I find with being on panels, it's usually the moderator I have more in common with, but they're not allowed to talk, or we're put with these people that are supposed to be, specialists, or just because they've reached some sort of status in their job or company puts them as this, expert or this insider. So I just, talking to Dee and, just wanted to put do something, and that's just really how it came about. It's just an idea, but I hope that we can really pull something out of this on an individual level and a collective level. And thanks, Rasheedah, for the great introductions.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. And if I can just have my one of my co-panelists, if you can let people into the room as I'm presenting, I would appreciate it. Okay, so just to go over the agenda for the discussion today. We've already introduced the panelists. I'm going to do a brief overview of systems thinking and structural racism. What is it? How do we think about it? How do we become more aware of it? And then the panelists are going to have a discussion amongst themselves. As Kamei said, there's not going to really be a moderator, but they've all have come up with questions for each other to share during the discussion. And then we'll have a few minutes of Q&A from the audience. Again, just in order for us to control things, and because these kinds of conversations can be challenging, right, we wanted to minimize our panelists sort of being interrupted and give them the stage to be able to talk. And so that's why we've muted folks, and you're not able to turn your cameras on, but you are able to use the chat. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat as things come up. There may be pieces where I turn to the audience and ask you some questions. So feel free to use the chat for that. And then again, we'll have an opportunity to hear from the audience in terms of any questions you have. So first, let's start off with defining our terms and frameworks for when we're talking about systemic racism and what it is. It's often something that can be sort of a buzz term or buzzword. And so it just makes a lot of sense to me, to sort of unpack what we mean when we say systemic racism. And first, just to, sort of highlight how we sometimes usually tend to think of racism, and usually we tend to approach it as a sort of racism as hate model. And this is the model where, discrete acts of bigotry are committed by malicious individuals. And although that is true, that also happens as well, that tends to be our most common understanding of racism. And under this version, it's sort of easy to spot, and it's clearly reprehensible, of course. What happened in Virginia, the storming of the Capitol by white supremacists, sort of the Archie Bunker model of just blatant white supremacy, white power association. So we know this form of racism. It's alive and well. It's recorded on camera. It's tweeted by, the presidents of the country. But what tends to happen is that we tend to use that as our sole understanding of racism often. And so the hate model makes racism seem like something that was more common in the past, but less rare in the present, notwithstanding, some of these more contemporary hate groups. And so because very few in society sort of take that way of thinking about racism, there's not every white person is joining a hate group, right? It makes it seem like racism on these terms is sort of unusual or more rare. And so that allows people to distance themselves from it. That allows them to distance themselves from this kind of hate conception, which again is sort of popular with the media, popular with the public, popular on Twitter. And it's also really preferred among conservatives when they're talking about racism. But again, what it does, it allows well-meaning white people to sort of secure their role in everyday sort of implicit bias that plays a role in perpetuating and sustaining racism at the various structural levels. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to look at, again, the ways in which everybody is implicated when we sort of turn to away from individuals as racist and look at whole systems as, perpetuating racism. So again, to define our terms, what's a system? System is basically an interconnected set of elements that is connected to coherently and organized to achieve a purpose. So again, interconnected set of elements that's coherently organized to achieve a particular purpose. And so systems thinking, the way, one way of approaching this is the ability to understand those interconnections in such a way to understand what is the desired purpose. And so we use systems thinking again to sort of make sense of these systems. We use it to sort of understand the dynamics and the patterns of a system in order to make that system more intelligible for us. And once it's more intelligible, right, we can design strategies, we can design tools that allow us to better create solutions and craft effective interventions in order to challenge those processes and challenge those systems. There's usually three parts of a system that we can name. There's usually the elements and players of that system. There's the ways that they interact. And again, there's the purpose that that system was created for. And so within this framework, systems purpose is not just its own rhetoric about purpose, but it's more about how systems behave over time to achieve particular outcomes and things for particular people. So these are just some examples of systems. The body, of course, is its own system. Ecosystems and nature, right, contain particular systems that are interconnected and work to achieve a particular purpose. Train systems and networks, obviously, our brains, right? There's systems in many things. For myself, I'm a housing attorney, and so I work with people who are facing loss of their home through eviction and through displacement and other means. Right, I see housing as a system. We look at housing as a system. And so that's, again, all of the interconnected parts that come together to achieve a purpose. And so in that system, you have landlords and tenants. This interacts with the government, such as landlords getting licenses, inspections. That interacts with the court systems if you want to evict someone. And then that system itself is racialized. And so within that system, within the housing system, there are disproportionate negative impacts on Black people and Black women and women of color in particular. And so there are ways, again, as an advocate, that I can think about how I approach this, right? I can approach things as sort of an individual on an individual level and just think about the person who's in front of me and that person is being evicted, right? And take it case by case, or I can attack the system. I can think about housing as a system. The many ways in which many pieces of it are interacting to conspire to bring Black woman after Black woman to me for, who needs help with eviction. And so really, both ways are necessary for me as an advocate. I both have to think about housing as a system and help the people who are in front of me. And then we have the music industry as a system. And so, there's features of the music industry system. I'll just name a couple, but I'm going to turn to my co-panelists to chime in. There's licensing, there's recording, there's publishing, there's music itself, right? Music itself is a system. There's notes and melodies that make a song, things that come together to create music. But then there is the industry, which is a system in and of itself. Some of the things that Kamei and I were talking about as we prepare for this, the fact that there's only 3 major labels, and she compared it to the government with like smaller labels acting as nonprofits. And then, you have journalists, music executives who play a role in a system, music platforms and how the music gets heard, consumers, all of those things that come together to create the music industry as a system. I'm going to turn to my co-panelists and see if they had anything to add about systems. And again, if you want to add into the chat anything that I missed.
I'd like to just sort of mention live music as another system. There's a whole sort of industry, the whole live music industry. And I also love thinking of smaller labels as sort of the nonprofits, depending on the label as sort of the nonprofits. That's a really good way of thinking about some of those, at least some of the better ones.
Anybody
think,
have been? Okay.
yeah, I think, all the hands that the music touches, before it gets to the consumer, I think that's a system in itself, because some of those people, you know, are not seen, kind of thing of when you label the different positions of people, you know, um, and just thinking about what positions actually play the parts and what positions just have the titles of the parts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah. So we'll get into this a little bit more as we go through, but again, encourage folks if there's other pieces of the system that you want to sort of name or call out, please add it into the chat. So now that we sort of understand what systems are and why it's important to approach things as a system in some situations, let's talk about structural racism and what that is. And so basically, one structural racism, right, is a type of system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms often work in various and reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. And so racism itself is a system, right? And so when we think about it and approach it that way, and then, when we're approaching racism itself as a system, again, this sort of way of being able to sort of unpack what that system does, that's what we call structural racialization. And that's basically a framework for understanding the institutional and public policies that, again, intentionally or not, create and perpetuate fundamental barriers to economic and social inequality, particularly for people of color and communities of color. And so when we're approaching racism through structural racialization, basically we're identifying the dimensions of history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and those disadvantages that tend to be associated with being Black and of color to endure and adapt over time. And so we think about social, economic, political systems in which we all participate and exist, and how these things overlap with each other, again, to sort of perpetuate, reinforce structural inequality. And it really, again, the reason why we talk about it as racialization as opposed to just racism is to be able to move away from this individual racism as hate model. Again, to step away from seeing racism as something that applies to individual folks, and something that is really, again, a part of a structure, a part of a system. It sort of gives us the language and vocabulary necessary to talk about and understand, again, why these things tend to persist, even though, well-meaning white people claim not to be racist, or, the law doesn't exactly, even though as a lawyer, I would disagree generally, but the law doesn't explicitly, right, make itself racist in the same ways that it did in the past. But right, despite that, racism still persists. And how do we talk about that? How do we move away from the individual level to really attacking the systemic level? And I also like the word racialization because it's more dynamic to me than racism. It just talks about sort of the present day circumstances of how these things interact, not the old racism model that we're sort of used to that hasn't evolved much since the civil rights movement, to be honest. So then with that, we can sort of get into talking about the sort of different levels of racism and how they show up. And again, these are all just frameworks. There's different frameworks, there's different levels, there's different ways of sort of thinking about this, but this is one level that I've at least have found to be helpful in my work. And so the 4 levels of systemic racialization include the personal, the interpersonal, institutional, and the structural. And we're going to get into each one. But I like to show this graphic just to show the ways in which these different levels reinforce each other. And so while the personal, right, is the beliefs that are within individuals and implicit bias, right, it starts to work its way up into how people interact with each other. And then, people make up institutions. Institutions are not peopleless things, right? They're made up of people. And so within those institutions, that racism becomes even more enduring, and then it works its way up into the structures of our society. And again, all these things influence each other, influence our individual biases. They get concretized and institutionalized in very durable ways. And so I'm just going to go over each of those sort of things again, the four different levels, just to show again some of the complexities of how racism shows up. So again, internalized racism is going to be what lies within individuals. It's going to be our private beliefs, our biases about race and racism, how it's influenced by culture. This can take the form of many different things, including racial prejudice towards others of a different race, internalized oppression, which are the negative beliefs about oneself or about people of color who may look like you, or internalized privilege, which is beliefs about the superiority or entitlement of white people or non-Black people. And so, a simple example, obviously, is a belief that you or others are more or less intelligent based on race. And this can show up in a lot of ways, especially, I can think about this specifically in like the educational world, right? And what children of color internalize about their intelligence based on curriculum, based on how they're treated in school. In the housing field, right? Black women who have vouchers, right? What they internalize and about the stereotypes and messages about people who have vouchers and what they come to believe or think about themselves. But again, it also works for people who are considered or who see themselves as part of a dominant category. And so what they come to internalize about their superiority is also internalized racism. So then there's interpersonal racism, which is going to be racism that occurs between individuals. And so it's the bias that occurs when individuals interact with others and their private racial beliefs affect their public interactions. And so obviously, again, I pointed out some examples at the beginning of some very obvious, explicit forms of interpersonal racism, racial slurs, hate crimes, racial violence, but also it's things that are more mundane. It's the asking a white person for his or her opinion, but not the person of color, sort of based on internalized beliefs about who is relevant, who's more intelligent, who's more powerful, right? Who we consult and who we don't consult. That's something that I deal with every day, as a Black attorney showing up in spaces where I'm considered or looked at by virtue of my skin color and having, the way that I look. I'm considered the tenant or the client, and I'm not given, any kind of deference in any way when I walk into some of these spaces, right? So that's kind of how interpersonal racism shows up. Again, there's these sort of explicit ways, but then there's the ways in which we've internalized things about value and valuing of other people and how that shows up, right? And I can go hours and hours talking about implicit bias and what it is and how it starts to show up, but we don't have time for that. So now to go to the sort of systemic level and to talk a little bit about the differences between institutional and structural racism. And again, these are both forms of systemic level racism, but just again, we're unpacking a little bit what these terms mean and when people sort of throw them out so that we know what we're talking about when we're again, sharing this language. Institutional racism occurs within institutions and systems of power. So intentionally or not, it produces outcomes that chronically favor or put a particular racial group at a disadvantage. And so this is going to look like, again, the things that are within institutions. And so school disciplinary policies is one example. The school itself as an institution and the sort of things that happen within a school would be an example of that. And the ways those policies work within the school system to disadvantage a particular racial group. Again, in the housing system, thinking of housing as an institution, the ways in which housing opportunities are structured such that the policies, right, the policies for Section 8 vouchers, for example, landlords in Philadelphia turn away people with vouchers 2/3 of the time, right? And there's no enforcement in terms of discrimination for race and all these other things. So again, the ways in which policies within institutions work together to create disadvantages for people. And then structural. So again, institutional might look a lot like structural, but really when we're talking about structural, we're talking about that final level, right? The sort of ways in which our history, our norms, our values, the ways that we think about different people who look different from us, who have different cultural norms than us. These are things that are not always tangible, but they endure. They are the things that become a part of our values, become a part of our institutions, trickle down into how we treat each other and see each other. So when we're thinking about structure, we're thinking about the cumulative, the compounding impact of an array of societal factors: history, culture, ideology, interactions among institutions, all the policies that work together to systematically privilege particular people and disadvantage other people. So again, one way to sort of tease out the difference, and again, there's some overlap, I think, but one way to tease out the difference is institutional racism is more localized. So again, you can often locate it within a particular institution or policy itself, whereas structural racism, on the other hand, tends to be a lot more diffuse and a lot more harder to locate in a particular place, because again, it's more about the intangible. It's more about what lies beneath the surface of these institutions, which is embedded in our values, our cultures, our norms, and things around beauty, who's considered beautiful or not, right? Those are values. Those are things that are less tangible. So just some strategies for addressing racism at the different levels. And again, this is kind of coming from a policy world perspective, but I'm curious to hear how musicians and other folks who work in the music industry would sort of apply these. But some of the things that we think about in the over on the policy world side is like support groups, racial healing, mentoring, counseling, education to sort of surface and address and more internalized racism. At the interpersonal level, diversity trainings, cross-cultural dialogues, those sort of things can be useful in getting at some of the interpersonal racism that happens. Within my organization, we've been having facilitated conversations with all of our staff. I manage a staff of about 30 people. And there's been, with George Floyd and the uprisings over the summer of last year, a lot of things have come to the surface. And so we've been having facilitated conversations that have been going really well and have been helping us to move through some of the tensions and to be on the same page around language. And so sometimes it works. I do have some skepticism sometimes, but it tends to work when we can open up that dialogue. And then at the institutional level, obviously some solutions, changing policy and practices, creating new institutions, creating our own institutions, which is something that Black quantum futurism thinks about. And at the structural level, highlighting history and root causes, challenging racist myths and ideologies, and then challenging multiple institutions or addressing their intersections are often ways that we can start to address it at the structural level. And again, because that structural level is so enduring, it's so embedded, it's so intangible, right? We have to be highlighting history. We have to be highlighting those root causes and those things that lie beneath the surface of the sort of iceberg. Okay, so I wanted to turn back to my co-panelists and see if we can just come up with a couple of ways that you all see racism, the 4 levels of racism in the music industry, both again at the individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural levels. So I wanted to turn to my co-panelists, just see if they had any thoughts. And again, if folks want to add into the chat where they see it showing up, I would love to hear.
I can jump in and I'll jump in just like into the institutional racism and thinking about just both my experiences, from preschool all the way up to my doctorate, the things I encountered that way, and then also, from teaching in public school, K-12, and now at the university level. So I think an ongoing problem, especially in larger institutions, is still privileging white European derived musics and putting them on this pedestal. This is music and anything else is other. And by other, it gets pushed into like, ethnomusicology or jazz studies, even though it may not be jazz, or, that labels, we already know that's problematic as it is. So with this problem, I think one of the problems in addressing this is that, you've already kind of mentioned it, like, since the summer, all these organizations and institutions have posted all these anti-racism statements. We're here, we're going to make some change, we're ready to do this. But then when it comes to taking those steps, they don't want to do that. So if you provide a curriculum which includes people who are not male Europeans, then that's kind of met with this feeling of threat. Oh, you're gonna, dilute the quality of this education, and things like that. So that, is an institutional problem, but then it trickles down to the student who walks into the classroom and feels like they're not welcome, they're not a part of this, or, yeah. So I mean, I'll just start it with that and throw that out there. I can keep going.
Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Yeah. I mean, I kind of want to just jump on that also, because I think that's important. The education system, because I thought it was, interesting or whatever, that I couldn't, as a young person, couldn't get in touch with an instrument. I had these kind of crazy thoughts of, like, how did someone get a guitar? Like, what is, just having this be like some other world, even though I went to school and they had a music program, I couldn't quite understand how to be a part of that, just playing an instrument or trying them out, versus just like, I mean, music class when I was growing up was a lot of like line dancing and learning all these different customs of dance and things from European countries. I don't remember learning African dance or anything like that. It was just about the different types of music and celebrations from all over the world. So I would just go into that of, I think that's pretty terrible, that I didn't have this access or couldn't even fathom how to go about getting this, these kind of things. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, hearing that hurts me so much. Thanks for sharing that. I'm so concerned with music education programs. I'm very, very lucky to have grown up with a dad that was like a trumpet player and learned like trumpet as a young kid in the Birmingham like school systems, even though like when he was a kid, like in the 70s and 80s, like the schools were still segregated in Birmingham and still technically are right now, through like sort of redlining laws and such. But no, I'm really lucky that this elementary school that I went to, Carriatuggle Elementary, was a school that was made by a slave abolitionist in my neighborhood of Eno Ridge, which is where like Angela Davis and like Colin Powell are also from. And this school was started for orphan Black boys that, and eventually like opened up to the community because of the segregated schools. And there was a guy named John T. Fess Watley in the early 1900s that started like an education program there across multiple schools in the city and across multiple colleges across Alabama, including Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University and Alabama State University. And he was also Sun Ra's first teacher. And I only recently found this out like maybe 2 weeks ago while reading Sun Ra's biography, and like wept because I was just like, why didn't I know that like this man was in my neighborhood? That was, also between the years of 1945 and 1964, I believe, were bombed over 50 times by white supremacists, including the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, which my aunt, who was supposed to be in, but luckily that day she moved to Detroit to be a music teacher. And yeah, thanks to her, I was able to learn about Brahms and, Wagner and Stravinsky and such, but also hear, get some rumblings of African and African diasporic musics through her. But no, anyway, what I found was that I learned trumpet at the age of 7 from my dad and from one of the professors that went through the system I just explained, this like 100-year-old music education system that exists in Birmingham or in Alabama that I went through. And what I found when I transitioned to a white school for middle school years is that, yeah, like Rasheedah said, the school system suddenly became prison-like. Suddenly, like I found that I was ahead of all the other like young musicians that were just starting in the 6th grade, but also finding out that I was kind of being beaten back into place to fit in with these other white kids that were barely squawking notes when I was like having already like accomplished like multiple skills and was trained, you know, to do such. And I played all the way through college, but I feel like I've never recovered educationally from that. I was like terrified of going to conservatory school. I was terrified of really like learning more instruments because I mean, it's one of those things where the music education programs, I mean, they've been defunded rapidly since the 80s. I mean, it just, yeah, I'm happy to have this talk because it's, I mean, I can even scale this all the way up to my moving to New York in 2013 and becoming a music journalist, which has been awful. The last like near 10 years has been the worst professional year, like times of my life, like trying to just get writings about even Moor Mother, like just getting writings about the people sitting on this panel now at NPR or something. It's always a struggle, and it the pay isn't worth it. It's like $50 an article, and no one. I always have this thing where when I'm talking to an editor, they okay, sorry, this is a two-pronged thing, but there's this imaginary audience that has been presented to me for since like 2013. This audience, this neutral audience that all music is supposed to just like make feel really good every time I write like an article, and no one can tell me who those are, this audience is. But based on growing up in the Black Belt region, moving up north, kind of seeing some parts of America, I could easily break down that the majority of Pitchfork's audience is Midwesterners, Midwestern like college kids, and you know, or I'll say 25 or 18 to like what 35-year-olds. And this imaginary audience in conjunction with this like lived experience that I had as a musician, having to download techno tracks and stuff in high school because there was no record store to go to. Yeah, I don't even know if the music industry or journalism itself can even come to grips with how awful of a time they've made it for people, and where to yeah. I'll stop there.
I'll just try to keep my comment a little bit quick because I guess like in the context of education, it's interesting to think about music education because as a kid, the only context for music, I don't play any music. I play guitar, but just for fun. I'm not a musician in any real capacity. And so the only real context for music education I had was at my church through a summer program where like we learned about like ragtime, early jazz, and I guess sort of history of I guess like sort of African American music from like the mid 1800s to I guess probably around the civil rights era. That's probably what I learned, and that's honestly was sort of the backbone of a lot of my knowledge of music until I got into probably my teenage years and started actually just reading books of my own. I didn't learn any more about that in any of the school, like regular day-to-day schooling that I had. So and I feel like that sort of gave me, I guess, sort of a similar, I don't know if to say inaccurate, but like I guess I feel like I had like a different view of a lot of this history because I was sort of be like, oh, did everyone not learn about this stuff from like age 8 or 9? I assume we all learned about this stuff about like 1800s history and early 20th century history, which I've learned is not actually the case. And I guess like the point that I sort of wanted to sort of make was just about the I guess sort of that individual level of internalized racism of education, which everyone who's spoken already has spoken on this. But I guess education to me, I always find in music, I guess more colloquially, the record industry has a very bad reputation for exploiting Black musicians. And that's sort of very colloquially well understood. But I never find that there's a lot more deeper understanding of that. I feel like there's very little institutional or even structural understanding of that. And I think that's kind of what I appreciate about the work of people on this panel. And that's kind of what I want to sometimes do in my own writing is like trying to take that one step back, or I guess one step forward. I don't know which direction the steps are taking, but it's having a sort of a slightly higher level understanding of it, because I remember learning about like Black musicians being exploited when I was like, I guess probably like maybe like 3rd or 4th grade in like those summer classes, but there was never really any context to explain why that was still happening nearly 100 years later. And I'm not going to put that to the fault of to like the folk that were teaching me at church. They were doing the best that they could with certainly limited resources and limited time of kids in the summer who want to be outside rather than watching like slides. But that is something that I still think a lot about, because I can still see that, and just even how people within the music industry, more particularly white people within the music industry, think about it, where they're like, oh, I can't believe it used to be so bad. And I'm like, but it still is for most of the exact same reasons. And you're in the position that's making it that way. So why are we not having those conversations? I think education, to what DeForrest was sort of saying earlier, is like education really, really is core of that.
Thank you all for sharing. Yeah, just everything you said. You said so much good stuff, all of which we could have further conversation about, and hoping that we do have further conversation once I'm finished the presentation. Okay, so I'm gonna just go through the rest of my slides a little bit quickly so that there's ample time for discussion. Just want to, again, as we sort of work towards where do we start to think about solutions, and how do we attack this, and much of what David was saying, how do we highlight this in our work? One of the things is that we need to be on the same page about terminology, and I think that's really important. And often when folks are talking about diversity and equity and inclusion and all these things, right, they're not distinguishing actually what it is. And that's important, because diversity is not equity. Diversity is really about variety, whereas equity is really about fairness. And so you can have diversity without equity, right? And that's what a lot of these institutions suffer from. Once they get the numbers in, once they hire a bunch of Black people or people of color, that becomes they've done their job. But diversity should never be the end goal, right? It's just one step towards achieving equity, more equity. Diversity is also not inclusion. Diversity can really, again, it's just about more quantitative representation. It's more about the numbers, whereas inclusion is more about qualitative participation. It's about not only constructing the table, but bringing people to the table and listening to the people when they're at the table. Because you can also just be at the table, but not be speaking up, or not be being heard. So, we got to do more than bring people to the table. Equality and equity are also not the same. Equality is sameness and equity is fairness. Equity may involve differentiated treatment, which is something that people don't like to hear, is that, we need to correct for history. And that means that Black people and people who have been disproportionately impacted by these systems may need different treatment in order to get to where they need to be. And so that might be what's needed in order to arrive at equal outcomes where things are the same for people. So this is just a cartoon I like to show, which kind of demonstrates some of these principles. So in the first image up top, right, it's assumed that everyone will benefit from the same supports. Each person is being treated equally. Each person has the same thing, which is one box. In the second image, individuals given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game. So in this middle box, being treated equitable. So the person who needed the most amount of boxes was given more in order to arrive at an equal outcome for everybody. And then in the last one, right, the systemic barrier is removed. And so we remove the fence that disallows everyone from being able to see. And so all people can see without supports or accommodations, because the cause of the inequity was addressed. And so the systemic barrier has been removed. But I think we could take it a step further, right, and get to liberation. So in the bottom cartoon, right, we have equality, we have equity, we have the reality, which is that often, right, the people who need it the least get the most. But then we have liberation. And even in liberation, right, this guy's wearing shorts, he was wearing pants before, so he's more liberated. And there is no fence whatsoever. Everybody can see the game. So how do we start to get there? Just one other framework that I'd like to introduce before I close out is this notion of choice points. And so choice points are the places where decision-making comes up. It's the places along the way within a system where there's opportunities for decisions or for outcomes to be influenced. And so basically when we're conscious of where these choice points are, where are the places where discretion shows up, where people are able to make decisions, where authority happens, we can sort of open up new possibilities for equitable change where we understand those places. And so I'll show you an example of this in a second. But again, just want to emphasize these choice points are decision-making opportunities that influence outcomes. They're the cumulative impacts of many small choices, which can be just as significant as the impacts of big decisions. So when we're talking about the criminal justice system, right, these are some of the choice points. There's many choice points in the criminal justice system. But again, these choice points are places where there's this decision-making authority, places where people have discretion. And when there's discretion, the more discretion we have, right, the more likely there is to be a disproportionate impact on someone who's a part of that category that we talked about earlier, which is Black people, people of color, part of these categories that have been deemed disadvantaged or deemed less worthy. And so again, you know, all those places along the way when we're talking about the criminal justice system, policing, who do police decide, you know, when they have to use their discretion about who they're going to arrest? When you get charged, the discretion that comes up there, who they charge, what kind of charges they give. Do they give someone a felony or do they give someone a misdemeanor? You know, if you have drugs and you're caught in the Black community with certain kind of drug, right? Cocaine versus crack rock, right? How many years in sentencing do people get? So discretion at the bail stage, who gets bail? Discretion at every step along the way. So again, the decision-making points, the places where decision makers are allowed to exercise discretion. And discretion basically meaning the decision or the power or authority to make a decision. And so in order to change a system, right, we have to examine how decisions are made at every point in that system by every decision maker, every choice point, every place where someone can make a decision. We have to be able to examine that if we're going to change the system. So this is just another example in the eviction system. Again, this is my work. You know, if you're a tenant and you are caught up in the eviction system, there is discretion for a landlord about who they're going to terminate their lease to versus who they're going to work out an agreement with in the first place. Whether or not you get served with a complaint all depends on the decision maker. Whether or not you're able to get a new court date, all of these different things, I'm not going to go into each one, but basically, again, just to emphasize that there are points along the way where there's decision makers. And so as an advocate, I'm designing solutions and I'm working with people to figure out the system. I know where I need to target it. I know I need to target some things at how complaints are served. I need to target how lease terminations happen, right? So again, that's sort of emphasis of that. So choice points in the music industry. Wanted to again get some feedback from my panelists here about other choice points in the music industry. These are some ones that I came up with, but I don't know. I'm not a musician, but basically just like who gets access to education about music, as you all just talked about, and then who gets opportunities to perform, decisions about how much they get paid, who gets promoted and marketed, who gets a music deal, who gets legal representation, who gets distributed their contracts, who gets ownership of music, so on and so forth. So I wanted to open it up to my panelists who have way more expertise about some choice points and how they show up in the music industry.
Some place I usually like to start with when thinking about definitely these questions of like ownership in the music industry is like how people in America tend to socialize around music, even prior to its particular like packaging and exportation over to Europe and the rest of the world. Like the music industry itself proper is an American construct built from the entertainment industry in the early 1800s from P.T. Barnum and Bailey's like circus. And it starts in its like proper form of like touring through obviously like blues musicians who are touring like independently throughout the Southeast, but also these all Black sort of jazz bands that would play alongside the, you know, the freaks at the circus. And I brought up this guy, John T. Fess-Whatley, earlier, but he sort of designed the first idea of the dance orchestra in the South off of seeing one of these circus bands and wanting to pull Black people out of the circus context and actually become a composer. I can't remember the other guy's name. Oh, P.G. Lowry was another guy who was in the Boston Conservatory that actually went down to join these circuses and to sort of formalize this music. So there's an interesting kind of passing of hands and alternative, but also interwoven economy that I found between Black music and like packaged and sold music that comes later. But anyway, I like to bring that kind of stuff up first, because when we think about things like the Beatles owning Little Richard's like records and kind of, and Michael Jackson having to like buy those like rights back from Little Richard, and then Apple like releasing the Beatles like into the world like in 2008. These things have an origin point, and it starts. I mean, I actually founded a lot of this stuff from Langston Hughes's History of Performing Arts. I don't know if you all can see that, but I've been kind of digging through this, and it's been extremely helpful to understand how we got to sell music beyond the currency of like sheet music and, you know, people being locked up in cathedrals to watch, you know, to be blasted at by like, you know, white male composers. But yeah.
Yvette, David, Kamei, anything to add?
I'll jump in for a second. I mean, because a lot of the music I've been doing, kind of like David said, like in my experience, I learned from early childhood, you know that the existing commercial music industry is pretty racist. So I never really thought of that as a entryway. And so I ended up in a different racist system of, concert music or new music, which, I mean, to go to the second thing there about like who gets opportunities to perform and, you know, how much do they get paid? So again, through my own experiences, which is either like doing like music for theater or, you know, these like concert commissions and things, you know, that is still part of this performative question of organizations claiming that they're trying to make things, you know, equitable, but still perpetuating this thing of, you know, these programs where access, I mean, basically the programs are pretty white male still in 2021. In February, the numbers of Black people, you know, spikes as people are trying to show how non-racist they are. But yeah, I mean, I think George Lewis just put out an article on this topic. I think it was like last week or the week before, with like he suggested 8 different ways to kind of decolonize like the art music practices. And part of that is, you know, opening up to who, you know, gets these grants or who gets these awards, who gets programmed on these, on different things. So like needing to change who was making the actual decisions or open up who was involved into making these decisions.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I guess to like look at that initial question, who gets access to equipment or education about music, I find this a very interesting way to think about this, because I often sort of think about music as an industry and as a business. That's mostly what I cover, and that's mostly how I sort of like think about a lot of these topics. So I kind of usually coming from the more commercial end of things. But I think recently myself and a couple other my friends who are writers in the space have been sort of trying to think outside of that commercial industry, only because there are limits. There are very real limits to what you can do. I mean, I think the end of the limits are the folks who, of course, know I support this in a way, but the folks that are asking for like justice at Spotify or being angry at big music streaming platforms. And like, that's totally fine. Support wanting to make those things better and more equitable and actually have it so folks who are engaging in those systems aren't feeling like they are just so at the heels of them. But I guess that's sort of why I have been sort of thinking and in spaces where I haven't thought as much about more, where it is like education, what are sort of like schools, the state, be it like cities or states or even the federal level, like what are we doing to support these sort of initiatives, and what are we doing to actually support the arts and supporting folks in these kinds of spaces. And what I'm going to, I guess, quickly learn is to what Yvette was saying, which is I can look to North spaces and I'll be finding a lot of the same issues. So I'm actually finding this very very like helpful to sort of think through that as I'm wondering and thinking about other places for music and thinking of places about music I don't think as much about, that the very same issues are going to still crop up and be there.
Thank you. Kamei, did you? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking about just all this kind of early, you know, when I had a band and just thinking about touring, you know, and how to do that. And I mean, I remember having to email hundreds and hundreds of people to get a few yeses, you know, and I always wondered, like, I know everyone's not doing this, you know, like, how do you meet that person? You know, that's how it was when I was starting in a band. It was all about meeting that one person that will connect you to a little bit of this, and then you got to meet another person that'll take you here, you know. But I noticed there was other bands in the punk scene that were able to tour, you know, but they didn't accept the type of punk we were doing. So we didn't get the skills to be shared down. We basically had to start from scratch ourselves, you know, even though we were all in Philadelphia, you know? So I just think about that is interesting within a small underground scene of, you know, who holds those tools, you know. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So I have just 2 more slides. Want to talk about really quickly some tips for systems thinking. And again, you know, a lot of this is just from another space, which is again an advocacy space. But I do think that these things can be done by anybody and used by anybody, and particularly for some of the issues that have been raised by the panelists. So some practical tips for systems thinking: learning to ask different kinds of questions. Has this same problem occurred in the past? Is this a chronic problem? What data is available about this problem? What structures might be coming together to cause this problem or this behavior? Over what time period will this system exhibit this full behavior that is of interest to us? You know, so those kinds of questions, thinking about things differently and approaching things from different parts of the system or different places along the choice point timeline. You know, and then practicing frequently. I find this helpful to, when I'm reading newspaper articles or different things that I have to read, to just think about systems within those things. Ask those kinds of questions in my daily life, and keep an eye out for signs of sort of systemic processes in my personal life or in my community. And so thinking about like, what's a reinforcing loop that might be broken, you know, around these systems. And again, you know, I find it helpful even thinking about in my own community. Surfacing mental models and learning about archetypes. So again, getting at, you know, the understanding the complexities and looking beyond just the surface of, you know, we have this model called the iceberg model, where you see the tip of the iceberg, right? But you don't see everything that lies beneath the water. And so thinking about that for the music industry, whatever that looks like or however that translates, but learning about the archetypes and learning about the sort of what lies below the surface. Learning to think of time differently, of course, as Black Futurism, that's what we're all about, is learning to think about time differently, which I'll talk a little bit more about that in 1 second. And then forming communities around systems thinking practices. And so when we're learning to think about time differently, just a few Afrofuturist time strategies that we use is working from a place of temporal abundance, understanding that time can be created, operating from a place where time is not scarce when we're crafting or negotiating solutions, thinking more long-term. It looks like someone had put in the chat actually about a long-term initiative around reparations for musicians that's looking into 2070 or something like that. So that's the kind of thing I mean, like operating from a place of temporal abundance, not just looking at what's in front of us or the next 5 years. Let's believe that the people who are in power are thinking out long term. They're thinking decades, if not centuries ahead, and planning for that. And so we also need to do that in our work. Thinking about things, thinking about the past, present, and future as open possibilities. May and I have been watching a lot of different documentaries about Black women musicians, and just learning so much that we either knew or didn't know, or just things that hit differently when you hear it in their own voice, right? But just like understanding that past is not dead. Like, we've been just talking about things like Betty Davis and the struggles that Billie Holiday have gone through look exactly like the struggles Whitney Houston went through, right? And Whitney Houston is a contemporary for us, but that past is not dead. It's very layered, it's very present. The future is also open possibility, it's not fixed. And then just kind of having an understanding of different institutional times, how it operates in white supremacist culture. I'm sure that's something that would be a really interesting discussion, talking about different timelines within the music industry, from all different sides of it, whether you're the consumer, whether you're the artist, whether you're a journalist, how different times work within that institution and how they interact or have tensions with each other. So I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to kick it over to the panelists to open it up for their discussion.
Thank you so much, Rasheedah. That was amazing. And I think it was really cool for everyone to get to take a chance to see things broken down. You know, things tend to just be this massive 100 words or something, kind of X-Men bomb at the situation versus understanding where people are coming from and the different perspectives and the different levels of, these systems that interact with us. I was talking to Rasheedah earlier about how, and this is something that I talk with Dee a lot about the consumer, like, how do we, get the consumer to even take a chance on something we know would be beneficial or we know that they would like. We all created about 2 questions each to just try to facilitate a conversation. Please feel free to comment in the chat or put questions there. I'll be taking a look at that also. Yeah, and I guess do anyone want to kick it off with anything, or should I just start with a question? Or okay, I'll just start. And I guess I'm going to start with what I said about the consumer. What can we do as musicians, artists, to connect with the consumer in a non-capitalist way? This kind of, I don't want to say wholesome, but at the end of the day, it's really this capitalist kind of exchange, and if the consumers are being hit with so much advertisement, so much type of hypnotizing beats that keep them in this kind of, one genre, I grew up with all kinds of genres, I was speaking about the music the education system, but I was blessed to have it within the home, but we need more than those kind of perspectives of just having our family listen to music or go to concerts. I just feel like, I don't know if y'all want to elaborate on that or just speak a little more.
Something that I've tried as a journalist is, one, to tell personal stories, like to actually try to get to know various like artists and to really put that story into an article, which is not exactly liked a lot of times in music journalism, I found, just because, like you said, Camille, like there's something that needs to be sold. There's a single that needs to be sold. There's a kind of like image perception. I think about a time where I wanted to write about Yada, for example. I was told by a magazine that we had to wait to introduce Yada to that crowd to sort of figure out how to like wedge them into their like subconsciouses or whatever. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Well, for one, I think thinking about people as producers and consumers is a kind of an awful idea, but that's not our fault. That's like how this works. That's, well, for one, how a scam works, right? The producers are always the sort of innovators and the first early adopters that are selling out the opium, if you will, to, the people that will consume it and be addicted to it and kind of keep wanting to consume it. That's what pop music is. It's pop, but like, you throw it in your mouth or in your ears like popcorn. And something that I've tried to do with Make Techno Black Again, alongside my partner and her business partner, with the clothing line Etcha is, yes, this hat with this kind of like, phraseology, this meme, but through the Instagram and through sort of my own journalistic works, I've tried to weave together to do some world building, to actually show that what the city of Detroit is as a proposed city of the future that both produced cars, like, globally, but also music, like, again, globally. Motown literally called its music the sound of America and was trying to flood America with this neutral but black made like music. And what we found is that despite, there being over 110, top Billboard hit records from Motown in like a 10-year span, that run with that record label ended in 1967, or they left Detroit in 72 after the 67 riots, which over 150 riots, erupted across the country while hippies were over listening to Fish or whatever, like doing Woodstock, which my grandfather was bouncing between both, actually. Interesting guy. But yeah, I mean, when we talk about producers and consumers, to be honest, I find it hard to look back in history and not see times in which those futures that Rasheedah kind of brought up that the music industry sees don't necessarily exist. What they saw was, I mean, a sort of accident of like, you know, specifically in the 60s, a bunch of kids getting access to psychedelic drugs, and literally like thousands of kids were like running away from colleges and running away from home, trying to not grow up and be adults, a la like the film The Graduate or whatever. And it's, I don't know, there's a kind of like interesting like adolescent chaos that the music industry is always trying to capture and tell all of us that our music and our thoughts and our feelings are supposed to be targeted towards. And it, for one, doesn't work. I mean, if you look at a Gen Z, like Gen Zs are not listening to music. They don't care. And I mean, it makes perfect sense that they wouldn't, because you have apps like Spotify that have literally trained people with mood stabilizers and mood stimulants, like a la like playlists, to not even hear music. Like it's just something to sort of drape over while you're performing another robotic, you know, tech industry influence like task. So yeah, it's like I'm always trying to figure out how to reach the consumer in a different way, especially with Make Techno Black Again, how to tell personal stories that touch both the artists that made this music, but also the people who, you know, didn't know that, you know, didn't know that, like, say, Mad Mike from Underground Resistance was in Parliament Funkadelic and was signed to Motown, that there's a direct through line between, you know, Herbie Hancock, who tried to make an album with Kevin Saunderson in 1990. Like, there's these beautiful connections that aren't being drawn up because, I mean, it's not available to consumers a lot of time. Like, I get those in my press notes that I receive in my email address every, you know, my email box every day, but not, as a consumer, I didn't get that. So yeah, anyway, to sum this up, I tried to use Make Techno Black Again as an aggregate to try another way to not sell people stuff, to just, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you just sort of said that I find very, I kind of want to start centering this more a little bit in discussions about like the record industry. It's like the record industry that exists just trying to sell stuff to teenagers, to like white suburban teenagers. Like there's a new pop star out. Her name I think is Madison Beer. She's like a white girl from Long Island that they're going to definitely try to make like a thing with the next kind of Ariana Grande type figure. And I was just like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like a 21-year-old from like suburbs of Long Island who comes from money. Yeah, that's who the record industry wants to make a thing. And to try to like fit all of other music globally on some level, which was Spotify in many ways purports to do, into the same box, into the same marketing mechanisms, the same playlists, into all of that stuff. I just don't, it's completely incompatible. That we try to make it work is very, very unfortunate. And I do think that that's why, yeah, like the label of the consumer, it is really, really, I actually find it really, really frustrating in the context of streaming right now as the consumer, because everything is so flat. When everything was like, and again, I'm 28 years old, so I have a little hard time to actually really remember this like pre-digital era of music where you would actually sort of go to record stores, buy CDs and things like that, because that's just truthfully not something I really did all that much when I was younger. So I came of more awareness of music in this digital age. But the idea of there being sort of like record stores and places where you could actually go, I mean, there are still like Black record stores in like the neighborhood that I'm in, but those things still do exist. So it is possible to have like versions of the music industry and music communities that don't just cater towards that sort of like, again, like sort of like suburban teen demographic. But when the entire rest of the sort of field is moving in that direction, and then even when like I go on Apple Music and I see like the new albums release, and I can sort of see projects from artists who I think are really, really great, who are making interesting music, next to like a big artist on like a Universal Music Group or whatever, that kind of flattening is really hard to sort of like square those two and try to figure out some way that those can ever sort of work together. And truthfully, they probably shouldn't work together. And probably they should be trying to get more ways to sort of break that, and trying to, instead of having everything be in this sort of big box, to try to break that big box right now.
I'll just kind of jump in there, because I don't know. Sometimes, I guess when I hear the word consumer, I kind of shut down because I have the worst business skills ever. But I mean, if I change that word to audience and thinking about like what that means, I mean, like how do you engage with an audience? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is like through social media, which I'm not the greatest at. But then I've lately been thinking about like localized community engagement. So, you know, like music making in school, like not, I don't, yeah, like working with schools or working with, thinking about like intergenerational contacts. So working in retirement or visiting retirement homes and doing music or getting them to do music, or making music with these populations as a way to kind of engage. But like the other, so I guess my problem with the thing about thinking about like consumers is, you know, as someone doing like independent, non-commercial music, most of the people that I'm making music for don't really have budgets to go out and buy music on a like in a sustainable basis. And so thinking about like, so how do you support the arts? How do you support musicians? Why should you support musicians? I mean, I think that same question also goes into like the journalism thing, like sustainability, like, you know, DeForrest, you're talking about like $50 an article. You can't live on doing that. So how do we find a balance of getting the audience to support like these arts? Or, I mean, do you need like just a handful of, you know, wealthy benefactors that are going to pump music into this? That would be lovely. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Yvette, I don't know if you want to ask your questions.
Sure. I mean, I guess I can kind of tie in one of my questions to what I just said, because I mean, I've been thinking since last spring, last summer, like this concept of defunding the arts, which actually I thought about the language when I think DeForrest, you're talking about the schools being defunded in the arts program. So maybe that term is not the right thing. But like when I was thinking of, you know, defunding the arts, like when the idea came into my head, it was really about, you know, kind of pushing out the current gatekeepers and redistributing how artists are being supported and how their music is getting out there. So, you know, part of that question is like, what would a system that supports, you know, well, for like Black music makers look like, that doesn't just mimic what's happening in the mainstream? And I don't have the answer to that, but maybe, I mean, let's throw it out there for conversation.
Well, I just saw a question actually that kind of fits into this about sort of navigating the challenges and politics of genre, because I think that's one really big way to start to subvert things is to, I mean, you see all these articles in Rolling Stone and stuff where they're like, oh, the Gen Zs don't know genre. And it's like, well, no, they don't. They know what multiple generations of people have been fed as, I mean, basically church hymnals that are souped up with like some high-tech EQing, a la like Quincy Jones. Gen Zs and also millennials don't know music, and to the extent that I think a lot of older generations do in regards to like going to see it live. Like, I mean, that's a blanket statement, but I think it can generally stand given kind of what David Turner brought up earlier about the idea of live music industry being a system unto itself. Times just watching record sales collapse and like dive from 1997 till today, like it's still going down, and I see all these articles that are like, oh, vinyl sales are going up, and it's like, no, physical sales are just like straight down. So I think when you asked Yvette, when you asked a question about like who do we get to pay for the music, I don't know. I think it's kind of a confluence of this very wealthy benefactor, but also, honestly, I don't want to call people consumers, but it is for the consumer to turn themselves into audiences and to figure out critically what it is their goal is, you know, when it comes to engaging with music. Because if the audience, the majority of people don't reflect on, if they don't basically delete Spotify from their phones at this very moment, delete Apple Music, and like go out and start buying vinyls from Bandcamp and in record stores right now, music will be gone in 4 years, I promise. And I'm not trying to be extreme, but it's when you think about what, you know, places like Spotify are doing when it comes to AI productions, and you see sort of, I saw someone mention Matt Dryhurst, who was a sort of mentor of mine, but if you've noticed him online, and I can say this as a longtime friend of his, he's kind of had gold rush fever running around telling everybody about non-fungible tokens, which really just sounds like packaging up Africans and, you know, shipping them across the sea. We're having like yet another, you know, frenzy of white men trying to figure out how to transmute value from one thing to another. And that first value, when, you know, bringing up the circus earlier, was taking the slave songs, taking these personal Black songs and transmuting it into something that's played in a Napoleonic style of band next to, again, circus freaks, and then transmuting that into, you know, blues, and then into Motown, and into, you know, things thereafter. I don't know if Americans can codify music outside of genre. And I mean, we've seen it in stores for years. We've seen these different labels. So at what point does the consumer, hopefully turn audience, decide to take control of their finances? I mean, and that's something that we need to see across this country as well, is when you have someone like Jeff Bezos erecting, you know, Amazon factories next to my high school, you know, which they've renamed Industrial High. It's, and that's the thing, my hometown is fighting Jeff Bezos right now. You see them on the news in Bessemer, Alabama, fighting for unionizations. And I told my Reaganomic, like, economics theorist father at the beginning of the year that this would happen. And I wanted to tell everyone here that if we don't do what the people in my hometown are doing right now with Amazon, with Spotify, with Apple Music, with whoever else, we will lose music in the capacity that we know it. And I don't know. And so I suppose maybe, I guess what I'm trying to say is that this becomes a thing of community engagement, as opposed to even both community engagement, but also actively attacking the industry. Sorry, I'm getting like manic, but I'm gonna drop a link to an article that I did back in October that I hope would kind of help people with this, specifically in the dance music industry, which I'm not really that concerned with the dance music industry, because I think that it's the little leagues of the larger music industry. And it's kind of pathetic that, you know, Europe has these like festivals going that make like a quarter of what the recording music industry makes over here, and try to kind of leverage the two as similar. But basically, I worked at the first electronic music magazine, Mixmag, and for 6 months in 2016. And while going through their documents, I found out that they were the ones who more or less designed the entire music industry. If you look at who the top selling DJs are in the dance music industry, Mixmag were friends with those people in 1996 and released a global compilation of dance music that would codify all of these non-Black techno and house artists, except for Carl Crux and Seth Troxler, which Seth Troxler is from Detroit. But they would use the magazine, but also these sort of playlists of that with sounds that were assigned to various global destinations like Ibiza to tell people what this music is and to codify it for them long before people had a choice in what they thought, you know, electronic music would sound like, whether it's for dancing or listening. And so, yeah, it's a thing where I think we need to kind of treat this like a people's movement. Like, this needs to be a people's movement where we all stand up and say, what is music for us as Americans? Not, and I mean, I claim to be an ex-American now because I don't think Americans have the gall or the dignity to make that decision. But I think that, I mean, as a nation, we need to grab onto music and figure out what it is that what it is we want from it, what it is we want from people like Coltrane, you know, or Whitney Houston. I mean, we talk about Free Britney, but what does that mean? Especially if it just means us stealing her music through Spotify.
Yeah, I guess this sort of goes to something that, like, it's been a topic of obsession of mine recently, and I'll try to loop this all together. Is that recently there's been a huge influx of sort of sort of private equity, venture capital, and sort of like investment firms into, I guess, all parts of the music industry, but I'll go like a very particular one, into the world of music publishing. And so you could sort of see that if you're an older artist, suddenly there are people that are willing to pay maybe 12, 15x the alleged worth of your catalog so they can now own it. And then they have this as an asset that they can now potentially sell off to other private equity or other sort of bank or other like JP Morgan Chase, like JP Morgan Chase or Citibank or whoever, like back firms to, again, just sort of accrue potential profits. I should say a little potential and alleged, because it's not really clear that this is actually going to be a money making venture, but that is sort of the state of sort of finance in 2021. But I guess the reason I've sort of been thinking about this a lot is because why suddenly are folks interested in this? And it's because of streaming. It's because of the fact that like certain parts of the record industry increasingly disconnected from the actual day-to-day artists are making money. So now this gives even more reason for financial firms who can sort of see that, hey, we can also make money from music, scare quotes around like music. And now we can invest into music. And then now we don't even need to really worry about artists. And I just sort of wonder, and I think to what you were just sort of saying, DeForrest, but like the end result of that is not music. It's something entirely unrelated to music. It's seeing catalogs of your favorite artists be traded back and forth across different firms. And you're like, oh, did my favorite artist get anything? It's like, no, if, and this is a big if they own that music, which for a lot of artists, and especially for these older artists, like a lot of these Black artists probably didn't even own all this stuff anyway. So we're kind of even at this point getting even more a little bit abstracted. But like music and wealth that they should have had is now just going to be even further lost and further abstracted. And I guess like my thought about this more recently is that I've been like toying with the idea of like states or cities buying back these things and being like, hey, instead of like, so New York City where I live right now, instead of it being that like the Wu-Tang Clan will sell their publishing to like a UK like investment firm, the state of New York or the city of New York can own it. And that could be something that like, hey, if you want to sample a Wu-Tang song, that's something that we, the city or who we collectively, they're like, that's cool, go for it. You don't have to worry about being sued to hell and back. Like that's something that I've been wanting to start thinking more about. But as we're having this conversation, I think it's what you were just sort of saying. That doesn't start with us having a conversation as a community and sort of figuring out what is it that we do want? What are the alternatives and what are the other methods that we can do that start separating and breaking us apart from these things? Because there's so many people and so many moneyed interests interested in music across various ways, but we kind of have to sort of, to me, start a little bit smaller to figure out what are sort of those bigger questions that we want to start trying to ask here. Because I don't know. It's very frustrating to me to read about music. This is why I was actually almost a little late to this call, because I was just like reading on another part of the music industry I hadn't thought a lot about. And when I read about it, I basically realized all the companies I had read about were just all backed by big music managers and tech firms. And I was just like, another thing where even if I was to say like, oh, maybe this part could be, maybe we should look at this part of the industry, maybe it could be a little better. It's still owned by all the same people that own all the parts of the music industry that I don't think are great already. So it's kind of, again, to sort of need to go back to sort of like early principles. It's like, how are we educating artists? And then like, if we're worried about like, how we're reaching artists, it's like, how are you connecting with fans? How are fans connecting with you? And how can we unmediate that from any of these things? It's not, I mean, it is hard to send emails and it is hard to like press things and actually get them to people. But like, and it was a thing 10 years ago. I do remember downloading MP3 from websites and just doing that. And that seems to me, honestly, right now, a much better solution than what happens now, where I have to assume my favorite artist put out music either through Bandcamp, but that as a more ethical way, or it's like, oh, I released to a music distributor to get to Spotify, Apple Music, and whatever. I'm like, at that point, you've already gone through 3 or 4 services I probably already don't support on some level. And now I listen to it and you aren't even getting paid for it. So it's like, okay, it's kind of clear that system isn't working. And so what are the other ones we can try to start us collectively more thinking we want now?
Yeah, just to come in from, from a musician perspective, just this kind of idea that I have of like musicians coming together to release together, not like a compilation album, but right now I'm dealing with all this like, okay, I got to release this band at this month and this band at the third quarter. But honestly, I just want to release music right now. You know what I mean? So I was just thinking about sound, and there's so many of us that are so wonderful in the scene. So I'm thinking if we can come together in almost like a Woodstock or 60 phenomenon of us aggressively releasing within a month, you know, and just kind of re-energize our own scene, re-energize what genre means, you know, almost kind of create this mass gang, I guess, or community that is troubling all of these notions, you know. I just, because they are all looking at us for what the trends are. You know, you can always relate to the basic ideas of humanity, narcissism, all of this wanting to be cool, this like missing out, belonging. I feel like we need to tap into those kind of things and take a hold of the narrative, not just on these little bits of album releases and platforms. Because I do not want to release music all the time in the same way, whether it's just Bandcamp, whether it's a major label, whether it's a boutique label. I want to be able to experience all of these different aspects within the industry, I guess. But I just want, as artists, some kind of way where we can trouble it with the sound, you know, kind of flip the tables. You know, they're infiltrating with saying we only should be listening to trap music or things that are derivative of that all over the world. You know, I go places, they're like trap. I'm like, I'm at the jazz club. They're like trap. I'm at the punk club. They're like trap. You know what I mean? This kind of like the swag of that, the rhythm, the hypnotizing kind of feeling you get. So that was just my idea. I don't know if any artist wants to like pick a month and black it out, but I could at least do 4 of them. I'm telling you, I'm ready. Like, let's just stir the pot. That's just an idea. And I'll stop there.
No, 2 things. First, yeah, great idea. Also, sorry about trap. That's from my neighborhood. Whoops. Gucci Mane used to live like up the street.
I listen to Future. I'm not trying to come at folks, okay? I do know a few Future songs, all right?
I avoided it as long as I could. Then I moved to New York and it was everywhere. But on this tip of like releasing kind of like this communal album, that's something I was trying out last year. And Yvette, you kind of mentioned this earlier also with this idea of kind of being outside the music industry and this sort of nonprofit institutional sector, which I have a lot of experience with, luckily, through Issue Project Room and being a curator there, and also with Friedman Gallery. But last year on Juneteenth, as it was announced, like I put out this record with a bunch of friends and put out like a book that my partner helped me put together with Make Techno Black Again. And like there's a bunch of features, like my 18-year-old cousin's on here. Like I saw her like spit some verses on like Instagram about, yeah, just like how she was feeling after seeing George Floyd, like my 18-year-old cousin. And I was like, you know what, like throw this on the album, let's go. And I paid everybody like, you know, $100 or so, like out of the Make Techno Black Again account from what we like get from the hats, which is designed to, like 50% of those sales from the hats go to music educational and arts educational programs directly in Detroit. But also we try to use it to pay artists that we work with. So Ace Smo, another friend, Cyanide, and my cousin Maya all received like something like a stipend, but also like they've been getting royalties as like, because we released it digitally at first and then all the vinyl's out and I've been kind of paying them royalties from it. While also the label, this UK label Planet View, got basically no money from it. It was kind of a reparations project where their entire label fee went to 2 different nonprofits. One was Black Emotional and Mental Health, and the other was Movement for Black Lives. And I think I managed to give them around $5,000-$6,000, and then use the other $5,000-$6,000 to pay myself and, you know, my friends, and to also have this artifact. Because I mean, we put this book together where I included an essay and got several friends, philosophers and thinkers to put together essays to review the album, because I knew that, you know, I know as a journalist for the last 10 years, I know how hard it is to get some random white dude named Ned from like Minnesota to actually like understand that there's something behind the music more than like I don't know, the stuff that makes his ears tingle. Um, and it and I know it's a dude named Ned because I've worked at enough magazines also to speak broadly. But no, but this was kind of my initial attempt at figuring out how to do this, how to change release formats where it's not so much about me, but it's about both like a moment. It's Juneteenth, like after George Floyd's gruesome murder, after like, you know, all of these evils of America start to surface, like to try to commune around something. And I hate that it had to be something so gruesome, but that moved me. So yeah.
So I know it's 4:30, and I think just a shift to take one or two audience questions. There was a question from Anango who said, as far as institutional racism, this conversation is making me think about venues, policy at venues as, police at venues as safety, racist insurance practices with regard to hip hop performances, who owns the venues? Oh, okay, that wasn't a question. Okay, sorry, I thought it was a question. There were a couple of questions in there, so I don't know if our panelists wanted to look and see if there was anything you wanted to answer, or if you wanted to share one more question amongst yourselves.
Just to say something about venues, I think this has been a really particular time where, by appearances, it seems like the field has been leveled, you know, with venues closing and the really fancy venues just being shut down, you know. I mean, I feel like on one hand, we have a chance to, as musicians, think outside the box and really take advantage of this so-called internet thing. But, you know, these people that are now really good at the internet, they've all been swooped up by all these companies and organizations. So I know that for a fact because I don't know where they are, you know. But also it makes me mad being here in Philadelphia and having to wonder, where can I do a show or an event or anything that's just involving me? I do not like that. You know, I feel like that's a reflection of the larger market. I don't think it's just me not having access to these kind of institutions. And yes, I could dig a little bit more, you know, and get a bunch of emails and send them out of who owns this and who's in charge of that kind of thing. But I also think that it also shows that our music scene, by the people who are in the arts and culture departments of these governments, that they're not tapped in, you know. They don't know what we're needing, what we're looking for, who's been doing the work, you know. They don't really know anything. So I don't know. I don't know if I even really answered it. I just said some frustration, but I did say some good parts about, you know, maybe there's something that we can do. I mean, I would love to have more agencies in these universities that are so close to our neighborhoods. You know, before it was like Villanova up in the Ivory Gates somewhere else, but Temple, University of Pennsylvania, these places are now in our neighborhoods. I would love to have Drexel. I would love to have more access, and they contacting me, you know, not me trying to find who's who or who runs what department. You know, I think we need to also look outside of academia, from academia, if that makes sense, from inside, you know. And I'm learning now, I'm doing mentorships. These kids have a lot of access to the entertainment world that I never even knew. Yeah, okay.
How about we just do a final parting thoughts from the other panelists, Yvette, David, and DeForrest, and then we'll close out.
Sure, yeah, no, this has been great, and you know, I'll be thinking on. I hope this conversation continues after Zoom time. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's like, you know, well, what can I do? How can I dismantle this entire system? And like, I mean, really, you know, it comes down to the small steps that each of us are taking. So, you know, from within academia, I've, you know, had this privileged position for like a year and a half, you know, being able to like try to dismantle from within. And from, you know, I'm thinking about like what I said earlier about, you know, community engagement in relation to developing an audience and educating young people in public school, or, you know, like why, you know, why should they invest in music? Why, you know, so, I mean, I think that that kind of thinking needs to start young. And, you know, yeah, I mean, I like the idea of like just collective. I mean, there's all these wonderful minds, and there's a lot of wonderful minds that I've met in the past like 11 months that we've all been trapped in front of our computers. And it would be great to just see, you know, these forces come together and kind of take some leaps forward. So.
Yeah, I guess like for my closing thought, I'm just sort of thinking back to something that happened at the beginning of the pandemic last year, which was that if I remember, and if I get any of these details wrong, please someone correct me. But if I remember correctly, there was a collective, sort of like a DJ collective named like This Woman, and I remember they like put out a call for like basically they wanted financial help because they realized, hey, we're not going to be on the tour, venue's closing down, don't know how long this will go. And I remember them getting like really pillared by like basically like white European electronic people who were like, how dare you ask for music? Like, how dare you ask for money? This is like, why are you doing this? And then being attacked for it. And I think about that. And I think when the moment I just, obviously a lot was happening at that point last year. And I didn't really think, and I just had other thoughts in my head just dealing with the pandemic. But I now really wish I had like followed that closely and actually spoke out more on that. Because if that's one absurd, just doing that. But it also to me speaks to sort of an issue where we kind of, I guess I'll say this from the consumer point of view, as a consumer, put your money where your mouth is. If artists and people are asking you directly for support or asking you to make a direct thing, support it if you actually support that. And don't say anything if you don't support it. I guess on some small level, I feel like a much more value. Like sometimes I disagree with things. So DeForrest mentioned Matt Dryhurst, who's like someone who I really like, I respect, but I disagree with him on this basic concept of like NFTs and a lot of other stuff. And I sometimes I'll mention it, but I just don't really want to make that like my cause. So I have to disagree on something where I know we agree on other things. And so like part of me has a similar thing where it's like I would like for if artists like have things and they demand it, like support them and try to like actually meet them where they're at and try to like actually figure out like if this is a way that we can actually start building something else. Like in that moment, that I still do actually agree. I think this is a moment still as venues have not started touring, who knows how touring will eventually go when that eventually starts back up. Things are going to be really disconnected for a while, even as things reopen at some point in 2021. And I think it's still a time for us to sort of think about alternatives and other sort of better and sort of other ways of going forward. And to what Yvette just said, I think a lot of this, or I'm being hopeful, I think when folks are able to start coming more together in person, when there can actually start being more like actual events and things can start happening in more IRL spaces, I think there will be more fruitful, like not only conversation, but also just sort of progress and new things that can be made. It's sort of hard to sort of, I think a lot of things about physical spaces, and it's hard to think about physical spaces right now when everything is still so virtual and so sort of disconnected, but being able to eventually meet back in physical spaces, be able to meet back and actually have conversations, sort of think through like, what if we actually own places? What if we actually had more collective ownership of physical places? So a lot of the conversations like, where can we perform? How can we afford work? Like, where can we perform? Where can we educate? We have the spaces and the opportunities to do more of that stuff. So just been kind of thinking a little bit more along those lines recently.
I'm really grateful to have had this talk with everyone and to kind of pick up on David's disc woman comment. I'm really glad you brought that up, actually, as you know, being friends with those people, like a part of that group, it's a thing. And also like, you know, I saw when Disc Woman got their first grant, like, and that got them off the ground. I was at Mixmag when Smirnoff Sound Collective gave them like the check that got them started. And it's one of those things where, I mean, I find both as a musician and as a journalist, and especially while working at a British magazine who set up that deal to get Disc Woman started, there's such inherent differences between the way that Europe values and distributes music versus America that I can't stress enough to Europeans specifically, because I don't necessarily think Americans as a whole care enough about culture to necessarily rely on to restructure this. this thing, but I think I try to appeal to Europeans to say, look, if you are working with American companies, you have to put pressure on them. You have to kind of show that, like in Europe, there's all of this cultural funding. They are putting, like techno in Germany is now an official cultural music, whereas Detroit is still in a depression. Still, like after what has it been, 40 years of a collapse? Like I was talking to one of the dudes from Underground Resistance just before this talk, and it's still, that city still needs help, and people still don't understand that just that techno was a distress signal about that city, or or signaling towards that city. And a lot of what I try to do with Make Techno Black Again in my own work is to continue what Underground Resistance and Mad Mike were kind of saying back in the 90s, which was, look, if you're gonna fly us over to Germany, put some money, like pay it forward and put some money back in Detroit. Like help us get some of these kids like at these community centers into the music industry. Help us build something up if you're going to have this sideline, like basically like kind of hobbyist industry off to the side if you want to compare, again, European electronic dance music over to the American recording music industry that fits within the Grammy structure. And to beat up on Matt Dryhurst a little bit more, he's a particular artist he's a particular technocrat that has partnered with another technocrat who comes up from a background in singing, a background in composition. His wife, Holly Herndon, has like a PhD in electronic composition from Stanford. She went to Mills, and they are over in Europe getting, like, I believe applying for German citizenship and getting access to these resources, whereas I, a black kid who was living in Brownsville because that's what I could afford. I don't know if you know what Brownsville is, but there's a whole like Chicago University Press book about it. It's miles of it's basically a concentration camp if you want to be like real about it. And yeah, again, I'll just close this up. It's a thing of, we just have to think differently about it. And I would love to talk to anyone who would like to make tangible, actionable steps towards making this better, because I frankly can't stand to watch it anymore.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. If folks are interested in staying in touch with each other, I mean, I have all of your email addresses, but please put in the chat, confirm if you would like to be part of. We don't know what it's going to be yet, but if you would like to stay in touch. Certainly someone asked about sending the slides out. I might send the slides out if you will promise not to share them with anybody. And as well as I can send out the chat, what was in the chat to folks so that you can have access to the links and resources and the great discussion that was happening there. I want to thank all of my panelists. Thank you so much for just spending your time, your expertise, your perspective, sharing your experiences. And I'll kick it to Kamei.
Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and sharing such wonderful things that we can all build upon. Hopefully we'll continue this conversation somehow, some way. Beanie Siegel voice. And thank you all again. Have a good afternoon, good night, good morning, wherever you are. Peace.